The Wonders of Life Pavilion is possibly one of Disney's most enigmatic offerings in the history of the parks. From its conception to its closure and even beyond, this pavilion has somehow evaded defunct legend status and continues to sit as an eerily empty reminder of a period past. An area which could have easily at any point in its timeline become a classic was riddled with issues and overshadowed by its counterparts time after time. Don't ask me why I've taken to the Wonders of Life Pavilion, as there's no real reason, especially considering that I've never stepped foot inside or even within 200 feet of the pavilion. Despite this, whether due to its shiny allure of a golden geodesic dome, or perhaps the mystery of what lies beyond the green mesh barricade, I've dedicated unreclaimable hours of my life to learning everything there is to know about this space. So in this video, we'll be undertaking an aggressively extensive research project, sharing information about the entire lifespan of the Wonders of Life Pavilion from its early inception to its ambiguous future. With less than 2 decades of operation under its belt and no major changes during this time, it might seem hard to believe that I have so much to talk about, but believe me when I say we'll be overturning a lot of stones. Before we get into it, I will say that maybe the Wonders of Life Pavilion is best left in the past. Controversial and seemingly contradictory as it may sound considering I'm about to present an hour-long essay on the subject, I don't think that bringing the Wonders of Life back in its previous form would be beneficial to the Epcot vision or even remotely of interest to a modern audience. For me, it's in the world of motion category where it had a lovely concept and definitely has ideas that could and should be used in reshaping the parks, but you can see why it closed. And that's really rich coming from me considering how hard I advocate for Dinoland. We'll be getting into all of the defunct fun very soon, but in the meantime, make sure you're subscribed and have a hot drink at the ready because we're about to go on possibly the deepest of dives in the history of this pavilion. I will be creating and uploading a far less comprehensive version of this video too, which is probably a good place to start if you're either already an expert looking for a recap or just want a brief overview. But as I said, I've given a disgusting number of hours of my life to this topic and now it's time to share its story with you. Allow me to introduce to you the Wonders of Life Pavilion. This story begins with the inception of Epcot, the Walt Disney Company's second addition to the Walt Disney World Resort in Orlando. Following the successful opening of Magic Kingdom in 1971 and a number of subsequent developments and expansions, it was only a matter of time before a new park would open as part of the Florida project. Spearheaded by Walt Disney prior to his death, this new park, which would open in 1982, would once again draw inspiration from Walt's master scheme, this time from his plans to build an experimental utopian community known as Progress City. Interestingly, you can still see part of the Progress City model today in the Tomorrowland Transit Authority's People Mover in Magic Kingdom, and this proposed city served as the foundations for the new park. So how did a residential utopian city, complete with hotels, motels, monorails and swamp rides, come to be a theme park? Well, the transition was unexpectedly easy. While still demonstrating many of the planned features and ambitions explored in the residential version of Epcot, the theme park would transform into more of a World's Fair exhibition, showcasing prototype concepts for forward-thinking technology, demonstrating practical applications of new ideas and systems, and exploring international cultures. Maintaining the same name as its predecessor, this updated incarnation of Epcot would be explored in a project known as Master Plan 5. In the Master Plan, Imagineers detailed comprehensive plans for the new theme park. While it does demonstrate marked differences from the park we know today, many of the pavilion's rides and ideas explored in this document would be present in the park when it opened, or be revisited in the years that followed. The original offerings outlined in the Master Plan were Spaceship Earth, Communicore, Energy Pavilion, Life and Health Pavilion, the Seas, the Land, Transportation, Space, and the American Adventure, which would serve as a gateway to the World Showcase. Some of these will sound very familiar, so take a moment to pause and match these up to attractions and areas that materialised in the park. The most important development in the context of this video though was the Life and Health Pavilion, which would become Wonders of Life. In the original Master Plan proposal, the Life and Health Pavilion was described as giving guests the chance to experience a new awareness and appreciation of themselves while learning that good health is based more than anything on their own personal responsibility and behaviour. Aesthetically, it would take inspiration from the whimsy of a circus, with visual motifs of flags and carousels and a red, white and yellow colour palette visible in early concept art. The pavilion was described in the Master Plan as being comprised of the following elements. Firstly, the Joy of Living, which was described as a multimedia show which would extol the beauty, dignity and strength of man from birth through the golden years. Secondly, the Incredible Journey Within, a vague attraction which would take guests to explore the incredible inner workings of the fascinating, complex human machine. This dark ride was set to be the main draw of the pavilion, transporting guests on a suspended track through the human body. The attraction was set to use the same ride system as Peter Pan's flight, and as they passed through, guests would see giant animatronic replicas of organs in the body, including a beating heart and 30-foot tall breathing lungs. And lastly, the Great Midway of Life, which was so blue sky at the time that it was ominously described as just a whimsical series of experiences. In cross-referencing sources, this appears to have been more of an overarching name for the pavilion's central circus-themed area than a ride. Other potential attractions mentioned across sources include the Tooth Follies, a musical, mouth-centered animatronic revue exploring good dental hygiene, which would be based inside a theatre lined not with curtains, but rather a giant set of teeth. Good Health Habits, a revolving carousel theatre not dissimilar to the Carousel of Progress, which would be a 3-part animatronic fable. The detail-less You Bet Your Life arcade. An unnamed ride described by Marty Schuyler as an infamous ride through the body with a controversial exit. And the Head Trip, where a crew of 3 brain pilots known as Emotion, Intellect and the Nervous System would educate guests on the functions of the brain and other vital organs in the body. Keep a mental note of that one, as we will be referring back to it. Upon entry, guests were due to be greeted with a giant waterfall and could also explore a sensory maze. From later concept images, it looked as though guests would enter through the pavilion doors into a circular room, presumably the Midway of Life, which had since dropped its great superlative. This inner circle had various other rooms sprouting off, housing bigger attractions. The easiest way to visualise this is with a compartment tapas dish. So, the Midway of Life would be the olives, and all the other attractions would be your antipasti pieces. One source, Progress City USA, stated that guests would move clockwise through these rooms, first entering the Joy of Living, then moving into the Tooth Follies, onto Head Trip, through Good Health Habits, and then into the incredible Journey Within, which was so large it had an attached show building of its own. When the park actually opened in 1982, however, it was notably without a Life and Health Pavilion, despite the production of detailed concept art and explicit mention of it in the master plan. It would take half a decade for it to finally find a home within the park, so what happened?
It would seem like Life and Health would make a terrific pavilion, and yet there's trouble in finding a corporate sponsor for this pavilion.
In projects leading up to the opening of Epcot, the Walt Disney Company had secured project funding through sponsorships or brand partnerships. The practice of forming partnerships and integrating said brand into their products is still common today, and has been since the inception of the first park, which opened to the public in 1955. To see this, you just need to look at the opening lineup for Main Street USA in Disneyland. The now iconic and kitschy street featured a Bank of America outlet, Coca-Cola fountain shop, and a Polaroid camera centre. When Epcot opened in 1982, it too featured attractions offered in partnership with some big-name brands like General Electric, who sponsored Horizons, Kraft Foods, who sponsored The Land, Spaceship Earth, which was sponsored by Bell System, Exxon, who sponsored the Universe of Energy. The list literally goes on. There were, of course, also collaborations with entire countries which helped to fund the project, but that's a topic for another day. And this isn't something that Disney tries to keep quiet either, with the Disney Parks blog piece by Chelsea Orban stating that the idea of working with brands is rooted in Walt Disney's legacy. Brand partnerships benefit not only Disney but also the brands involved. Disney gets funding from the brands either to create or develop an existing product, and the brands get unavoidable exposure. Every time a guest goes on the ride or buys a drink or walks into a shop on Main Street, they'll be exposed to the brand and they'll form a connection between the brand and their happiest family memories. And don't forget that every time they go to the stores at home and see a Kraft mac and cheese or deposit a check at the bank, they'll think of Disney too. The practice nurtures a mutualistic symbiotic relationship between the two companies, and everybody wins. So, considering all of the above, it was no surprise that when it came to opening the new pavilion, which was announced on January 22nd, 1988, this too would be sponsored. However, this new pavilion, centred around healthy lifestyles, the human body and fitness, was a little bit trickier to match a partner to than, say, matching a car company to a ride about the development of motor vehicles. And the reason for this may have been the complexity of the subject matter. The pavilion had been created following consultations with and presentations to medical professionals, plus the establishment of a whole advisory board which featured academic professors, directors, chairmen, and PhD scholars.
We had a professor, Dr. Charles Lewis from UCLA, that's #1 health educator in the United States. And he became our key guy to work with. And what happened was we went to conferences and all the health people fight with each other. No, eggs are bad. No, eggs are good. I mean, nobody can agree on anything.
Marty Schuyler, then president of Walt Disney Imagineering, explained that the pavilion's subject was much more controversial than any other subject that they'd ever taken on before, sharing that theories about healthcare and how to manage your own body had changed a lot since the idea's conception. Instead of preaching, they were eager to find a way to express an element of ownership and personal responsibility, and explain the influence of life choices to make an informed decision on one's health. It's easy to see how this, when battling with the beliefs and agendas of a potential sponsor, led to delays. Either way, MetLife, one of the largest providers of insurance, specifically life and health insurance, came into the picture, signing on as the corporate sponsor for the entire Life and Health Pavilion, which would soon come to be known as Wonders of Life. The Wonders of Life Pavilion was to be sandwiched between two existing attractions, Horizons and the Universe of Energy Pavilion. I know it's a minor thing to get hung up on, but there's a lot of contradictory information about the opening date of Wonders of Life. Most online sources state that the opening date was October 19th, 1989, but this was actually the soft opening. The official opening date dedication took place on October 30th, but strangely the Walt Disney Company 1989 annual report states that Body Wars took its first flight in November of 1989, despite press kits also listing the opening date as October 30th. Either way, the Gold Dome opened to relative fanfare and was popular amongst guests, regardless of what retrospect would have you believe. There are multiple videos of the pavilion being full in these early days, and there were also reports of guests waiting up to 90 minutes for attractions. Despite the long list of proposed attractions and offerings, the Wonders of Life opened with two major attractions, a screened film, a live performed show, and multiple interactive elements. It also had a quick service restaurant and a shop. It's very easy to understate the size and the scale of the pavilion based on its exterior, so let's do a full breakdown of the featured offerings to put things into perspective. One of the first things guests would see upon entering was a circular map outlining the contents of the pavilion. In later years this became skewed and misaligned, but for the first decade or so of operation it served as an accurate wayfinding point. The raised entryway would overlook an area known as Fitness Fairgrounds, an open space funhouse / collection of hands-on attractions teaching the wonders of your body, and this area was very reminiscent of the midway of life outlined in the master plan, and featured high window tile ceilings, and suspended from the ceiling was a mobile designed by Imagineer Rolly Crump. Within the circular Fitness Fairgrounds hall, there were a mix of attractions housed within the whimsical circus tents and those out in the wild. First up, moving clockwise, you'd find the obligatory gift shop Well and Goods Limited. They appear to have sold generic Mickey Mouse branded shirts and polos, equipment for healthy living, gifts, and Wonders of Life mementos, including ride merchandise like shirts, and other items I found included healthy living books, matching sweatsuits, although that may have just been a creative team or corporate gift, and postcard sets. The first attraction guests would encounter was Goofy About Health. This 8-minute short film looped on 7 screens built into a cityscape. The film explored Goofy's unhealthy lifestyle and educated guests on proper health habits. Combining grim health-related songs and clips from almost 3 decades of cartoon shorts, this was best appreciated as a rest space for those who wanted to avoid the most intense attractions. Speaking of, next up was Body Wars, the pavilion's featured thrill ride which replaced the conceptualized The Incredible Journey Within. This was set to be the centerpiece of the pavilion.
World has unveiled a new ride that promises to take people where no humans have gone before.
Here we go!
There's a new called Body Wars.
Body.
This thrill ride takes its patrons on a journey never attempted by man inside a seemingly impossible destination, the human body. The ride combines special effects on screen with a flight simulator that gives a roller coaster effect and the amazing Disney imagination.
Instead of the proposed Peter Pan's flight suspended vehicles, Body Wars would use the military-grade flight simulators used in Star Tours. The Star Tours simulators reportedly cost $500,000 each, so it would be a fair assumption that the Body Wars simulators were in a similar price bracket. Using the same sound and flight technology pioneered 2 years earlier in Star Tours, Body Wars would invite guests to shrink down to the size of a cell and explore a designated sub-skin safe zone of a volunteer who had recently got a splinter. The film was directed by Leonard Nimoy of Star Trek fame. The research trips being undertaken by guests were operated by the Miniaturized Exploration Technologies Company, or MET for short. And the 26-ton ships, captained by a Captain Braddock, would be miniaturized and then penetrate the epidermis via what was effectively a laser beam. The plan was to join another researcher, Dr. Lair, who was already inside the body studying the speed and effectiveness of white blood cells at the target splinter site. In an unexpected turn of events, Dr. Lair would be pulled into a capillary and the research trip would turn into a rescue mission across the body. As the ship's fuel levels dropped, the ship would be piloted to the brain, using the heart's beat as a propellant. After an energy shutdown in the spinal cord, the brain's electric energy provided the final push needed to restart the ship, facilitating their removal from the body.
Science fiction storyline that we've developed that has to do with really a chase through the immune system in an attempt to rescue a doctor who leaves the craft to take a sample and gets carried off through the bloodstream.
And these explorers seem to think the eye-opening idea lived up to the execution.
Like a roller coaster ride.
Where they felt like the heart was actually pumping.
It was incredible. Wild.
It was rougher than I expected. You really are bounced around a good bit while you're in the capsule, but it was fantastic.
The ride received really mixed reviews, with some describing it as thrilling, but many others complaining of motion sickness due to its intensity. The first version of the ride when it opened included a very intense whooshing lung sequence, but discourse suggests that this section was shortened around 1990, perhaps to make the ride slightly more palatable. And while I can't find exactly when these were made available, they did also offer lower intensity flights, which were basically a smoother simulation. Next up was the Wonder Cycle's bike path, which protruded from either side of the bodyworld's entryway. These cycles, however, were stationary, so no need to watch for passing traffic. In one of the earliest virtual spin classes, guests would pedal along to a video on the screen before them. Their pedaling speed dictated the speed of the video, which featured 3 recorded routes, including a trip down Main Street in Disneyland. Just beyond Wonder Cycles was the Met Lifestyle Review, as in hoop-de-doo, not academic review. Guests would complete a survey on the computers, answering questions about their lifestyle choices, for example smoking, exercise, stress levels, age and weight, and be given a blueprint for building a healthier life. One question asked guests how stressful their life was, with Goofy depicting various levels of stress. Further on was Coach's Corner, which allowed guests to record and compare their sports skills against pro athletes. They could practice baseball, golf or tennis, and compare their strokes against those of a sports pro, which were shown on large screens. In the early days of the pavilion, many notable sports personalities made an appearance, offering up advice to guests in person, including former Mets catcher Gary Carter.
Oh, I definitely think so, because you were marvelous.
Tucked away to the back, Frontiers of Medicine was the most obviously educational section of the pavilion, with research and medicinal achievements presented as museum exhibits. Research findings rotated to keep them up to date, but more permanent topics explored included the brain, the immune system, and even bodily processes like aging. Then, the second notable attraction of the pavilion, Cranium Command, followed. Cranium Command was a derived product of the Head Trip, and would be worked on by a number of future legendary Disney creatives, including the Hunchback of Notre Dame directors, and a then animation intern named Pete Docter, who would go on to direct a film with a very similar premise with the ride, Inside Out. In this attraction, guests would watch a pre-show video and then enter a 200 capacity theatre, complete with screens and a 3-foot animatronic anthropomorphic character sat in a chair. This character, known as Captain Buzzy, was tasked with the tricky job of operating the unstable craft that is a 12-year-old boy's brain. Throughout the 17-minute show, which takes viewers through the day of a life of Bobby, Captain Buzzy would swing across the set as he reacted to the stimuli Bobby was facing. He'd interact with other characters along the way who represented specific parts of the body, including the stomach and the hypothalamus, and many of these were portrayed by famous actors and comedians. The show was a hit as it was full of relatable coming-of-age scenarios for kids, and also enjoyable for parents who would not only recognise some of the familiar cameos, but also enjoy 17 minutes of pure air-conditioned peace. Despite its changes, Cranium Command still felt reminiscent of the original Head Trip plans, with the 3 brain pilots merging to become one key pilot, and the story exploring how different parts of the body collaborate in day-to-day functioning. After exiting the attraction, guests would be able to explore the sensory fun house, which featured audio antics. In Audio Antics, guests were able to sit on headphone-shaped benches and listen to audio which was specifically created to test their brain. Seemingly ordinary audioscapes would feature unexpected and out-of-place sounds, and it was the listener's job to identify these. Other small attractions in the area were optical illusions, which were, as the name rightly suggests, printed optical illusions. Perplexion pipes, comprised of 2 metal pipes with water running through them, one hot and one cold, and so when you held them you were just really confused about the temperature. Touchy subjects, a column and a series of bristle-lined touch boxes featuring different objects, including cars, giant chess pieces and dinosaurs, which guests on the other side of the box would be able to see. Reading Braille, which, again, as the name suggests, allowed guests to read Braille prints. And the Crooked Room, a room similar to those found at Ripley's Believe It or Not, designed to play with perspective. The room had cameras so you could watch yourself, and functioned both as a test of balance and senses and also as a fun illusion. Instead of the originally planned Joy of Living, you'd then find the Making of Me show, which would be marked on maps as the Birth Theatre. The multimedia show, which would extol the beauty, dignity and strength of man from birth to the golden years, came into fruition as a 14-minute meta-film starring actor and comedian Martin Short. The film had a content warning and would still explore the themes of the progression of life outlined in The Joy of Living, starting with an introduction of Martin's parents, explaining some anatomical basics, and then progressing forward to baby Martin Short's birth. It was filled with euphemisms and allusions, but it was also really educational. Our final entertainment offering would be the Anatomical Players, a live, mostly improv comedy show. The players would perform abstract skits about flossing your teeth or the immune system and answer audience questions. There were also further opportunities for audience participation, with younger guests being invited up on stage to assist with the acts. The last stop in the pavilion was the Pure and Simple snack bar. Originally named Desserts and Things and renamed in 1990, this was the sole food outlet in the pavilion. Pure and Simple served problematically named guilt-free goodies, aka low-fat foods, and their breakfast menu featured bagel sandwiches, pizza, cereal and milk, fresh fruit cups, and a fan favourite item, the Wonder Waffle, which would be adorned with items from a topping bar before this was phased out in favour of a toppings cup. They also served items like chicken salads and tofu hot dogs later in the day. Healthy choices were denoted on the menu with a red apple, although as time progressed the menu steered away from primarily red apple options to offer some fun alternatives such as root beer floats. Neither good health habits or the tooth follies were to be found in the pavilion in really any sense, meaning there was only one animatronic in the pavilion and no rotating carousel. But while we discuss attractions, I'd like to mention a choice made by the Disney company which potentially doomed the pavilion before it even had the chance to succeed. Mostly because narratively it doesn't fit anywhere else in the video, but also because it was so close in time frame to the opening. To remind you of our key relevant points, the pavilion opened in October of 1989. Its key attractions were its sit-down animatronic show, Cranium Command, and the high-thrill e-ticket attraction, Body Wars. Earlier we mentioned and swiftly moved on from the fact that the Body Wars was created using the same ride system as Star Tours, which debuted in Disneyland in 1987. So logically, when just 2 months later Star Tours opened in the MGM Studios park 15 minutes down the road from Epcot, that also used the same ride system. Which meant that by the end of 1989, there were 2 brand new, almost identical rides available for guests to choose from. So now we discuss why this may have been damaging for the pavilion. Consider which of the following sounds more appealing. A high-speed action ride where you'll get to go on an adventure with characters from one of the decade's biggest films, or a high-speed action ride where you'll get shrunk down and go inside the human body. Oh, and don't forget the last one makes people violently sick. On a wider scale, considering the family market, why would you choose to visit an almost decade-old park based around education when you can visit a brand new park and see all your favourite movies in real life? It really was an interesting choice to do this, and it may well have been more detrimental than the Disney company could have ever imagined. Despite this, the impressive lineup of attractions was enough to keep guests entertained for over a decade, but before long the crooked rug would be pulled from beneath the pavilion's metaphorical feet and begin a chain of events which would change its trajectory forever. Unfortunately, all that is gold does not glitter, and that could not be truer for this 100,000 square foot gold dome. Things started to look quite gloomy for the Wonders of Life Pavilion around the turn of the century. It had seen no expansions or real updates since it opened a decade prior, and the pavilion was being overlooked in favour of its newest neighbour, Test Track, which opened in 1999. While the attractions in Wonders of Life relied on screens and simulations, Test Track was all about real physical thrills as guests were transported into a General Motors, see that sponsor, testing facility. The ride would demonstrate top speeds of over 100 km per hour, making it the fastest Disney theme park attraction ever to be built, a title which it still holds to this day despite the opening of Tron Light Cycle. In the same year as Test Track's opening, Horizon, Wonders of Life adjacent attraction, were closed. Considering sightlines, Horizon stood slightly ahead of the Wonders of Life Dome. If you were walking to Future World from Communicore, the Horizons building would be the first thing you'd see, and then after taking a slightly windy, shrubbery-lined path, you'd see the Wonders of Life. Therefore, guests may have seen the imposing angular structure and its closed signage before they saw the dome and assumed that that too was closed. All of this speculatively to say, the Wonders of Life Pavilion was slowly losing some of its appeal, and it was only downhill from there. Within a year, it was announced that the pavilion's sponsor, MetLife, chose not to renew its contract. In their 2000 annual report, MetLife shared that the company had transformed itself from a mutual to a stock ownership company that year. This may have seemed irrelevant on its own, as many stock ownership companies partake in brand partnerships, but it's reported that sponsorship costs for the pavilion as late as 2001 were still in the low millions. So you can see where we're going from this. Now driven by a refreshed desire to increase profits to appease shareholders, it was inevitable that cost-cutting measures would take place for MetLife, including in external projects. Coincidentally, this ownership change aligned nicely with the formal end of the company's contract in December 2000, but the dissolution only became official the following year after negotiations for a new agreement failed. The anatomical Players troupe shows had already stopped by that point and instead been replaced by Nurse Danny Devaney's one-man show, Wonders of Life, perhaps indicating that funding was starting to run low prior to the contract's announced end. The announcement process began on the 31st of May 2001, when an email was sent to MetLife employees informing them that the company had ended its involvement with the Wonders of Life Pavilion. Employees then only had a week to submit discounted ticket requests, bringing us up to June 6th. 4 days later, on June 10th, 2001, it was publicly announced that the partnership would be ending, but, interestingly, Intercot reports that all MetLife references had been removed from the pavilion by June 7th, which was 3 days prior to the announcement. The idea that MetLife's ownership transformation was an influencing factor in this decision was echoed by news outlets too, with the Vice President of Public Relations stating that they were just putting their money in a different place. Other sources suggested that the contract termination may have been linked to an internal dispute over Disney cast members' insurance policies, but I couldn't find any concrete evidence for this. Not too long after the contract's end, a Disney spokesperson shared that they would always be open to talking to another company about sponsorship of the pavilion, and guests speculated about potential replacements, including companies like Bally Total Fitness. Despite these high hopes, no new sponsor would take over the Wonders of Life Pavilion, officially marking the beginning of the end. Reports state that following the withdrawal, Disney limited its spending on the pavilion to routine maintenance and basic staffing. Although the MetLife logos quickly disappeared from the pavilion, most of the attractions continued to operate normally through to 2003, even without a sponsor. By the end of the year, however, it had been quietly announced that the Wonders of Life Pavilion would begin operating seasonally, leading us into a quick and seemingly intentional spiral of decline. January 4th, 2004 was the final day of standard operation hours, and by January 5th, the seasonal operation hours had begun. Sources cite that it operated only during busy periods when Epcot needed additional guest capacity, but this didn't seem to be too often over the next 3 years. I searched through dozens of forums to try and build a timeline for opening, and as expected, it was much harder to find information on open days than it was closed days. But many of those who reported visiting on open days stated that they were the only ones there. On top of this, reports of poorly maintained rides and frequent breakdowns during its limited openings weren't hard to come by either. As expected, the open days mostly fell within the spring break or Christmas periods, with a few exceptions for random days scattered throughout the year. It was open briefly during spring 2004, closed for a few days and then reopened. It was open June 2004 but then closed by July, all the way through to December, when it briefly opened over Christmas before closing again. Open for 2 weeks in February 2005, closed by March 3rd. Open for 2 weeks, then no reports of it being open through to November of the same year, at which point signage was starting to be removed and merchandise locations were being limited. By December 2005, both the Wells and Good limited merchandise and the Pure and Simple food outlets had been boarded up, so there wasn't even a spot to eat within the pavilion during this period. Wonders of Life would open for Christmas Day, but be closed by January 2006. Open, close, and then it just didn't open. The pavilion didn't even open during the 2006 Easter period, so that's when we knew it was really over. Despite opening unexpectedly during the 2006 Christmas period, the pavilion would not go on to see another year, as it shut its doors for the final time on January 1st, 2007. The issue with seasonal operation is that when the area is closed for 90% of the year, those visiting in the 10% window aren't likely to think or even know to visit. If they do, they've heard that the rides don't work and it's not worth spending your time there, and all of this creates a potentially intentional cycle of limiting operating windows due to a lack of popularity, but then the pavilion becomes unpopular due to a limited number of openings. The area is then not popular enough to justify opening under nearly any circumstances, so you further limit operations, and so on and so forth until it blurs into sad obscurity. To summarise, it's an easy way to justify closing something that maybe you couldn't close otherwise. Seasonal operation aside, it didn't help that objectively the Wonders of Life Pavilion and its offerings were so uninspiring compared to their counterparts, and were frequently described as old and dated. Comparable attractions like Star Tours and Stitch's Great Escape, allow it, were operating in other parks which arguably had more to offer and featured exciting intellectual properties. Cranium Command and Body Wars, however, didn't offer any recognisable characters or, given their lack of popularity, any real reason to visit. Say what you will about IP integration, I also have a lot to say about it, but it really does help to bring people in and to make allowances for otherwise stale attractions. The colour palette described by Yesterland as reminiscent of Miami Vice was very much of its time, and with Epcot beginning to shift away from its 1980s educational roots, the pavilion just wasn't a great fit for the park by the early 2000s. Thankfully, it wasn't long until guests were able to step foot into the pavilion again, but this time, it would be for a very different experience. To summarise and to keep everyone up to date, following its steady decline, the Wonders of Life Pavilion officially closed on January 1st, 2007 after 3 years of seasonal operation schedules. Feedback wasn't great from those who were able to experience it during high season periods, so it was to be expected that it would shut in due course anyway. Over the next few years, remnants of the pavilion's history were erased from the park and the pavilion itself. This was documented comprehensively by Yesterland.com for almost a decade, recording how the pavilion shifted from an attraction hub to an alternative use space, slowly losing its identity. As time ticked on, the pavilion's contents and any reference to them would gradually disappear, piece by piece, covered by temporary signage or simply removed altogether. During the slow decommissioning period, the potential of what is effectively a large convention space was realised, and the area began to be used for a number of festival events. In 2007, just months after closing, the pavilion was used for the Food and Wine Festival, with racks and racks of wine on offer for guests, which is almost ironic considering the original theme of the pavilion. During this event, signage was still visible, including the Body Wars sign. By 2008, however, for the Flower and Garden Festival, the sign had been covered up with a fabric banner which read, "Welcome to Garden Town." For the festival, the pavilion was transformed into Garden Town, which featured a number of event-themed areas like Garden Town Mercantile, Garden Town Kid Fun Fair, and Garden Town Library. You can't fault consistent branding. While the festivals were running, many attractions were still present and presumably fully intact in the building, with just the entrances roped off. Goofy About Health, however, was being used as an ABC promo theatre, and in the years that followed, parts of the more notable attractions began to be removed. When Star Tours The Adventure Continues was being created, early versions of the ride would be tested in the Body Wars simulators. Presumably around and from 2010 when the reimagined Star Tours opened, the simulators were also stripped of parts to replace sections of the Star Tours vehicles, as it was cheaper and there's no point in buying new parts when they already had them. This sad fact was confirmed by Disney themselves. It was reported as of November 2014, the simulators had been removed entirely, and despite the queues still being intact, most of the lighting and electronic equipment had been removed too. Use of the pavilion for festivals continued as late as 2017, when it was used for the final time for the Food and Wine Festival. Earlier in the year, the space had reportedly been used for focus groups, but this would be the last time general access would be available to the pavilion. Over the next few years, the pavilion would sit largely empty and unused, a former shell of what it once was. After it closed its doors in 2017, very few members of the public would ever step foot in the space again, but, as always, a brave few would. As with all great Disney discards, the Wonders of Life became an urban exploration hub, and one of my favourites at that. And this was to be expected given how large and tempting a target it was. At over 100,000 square foot, it was a big and undeniable draw, and quite an easy one to get access to. I'll do a video on the ethics and motivations of urban exploring another time, specifically contextualised within the tourism sphere. But regardless of how you feel about it, Epcot was the birthplace of the Disney urban exploration subgenre with Hoot and Chief's Horizon Adventures. For context, Hoot and Chief are regarded by many as not only the founding fathers of Disney urban exploration, but as being responsible for some of the greatest attraction archival there is. While their focus was on the Horizons ride, which stood adjacent to the Wonders of Life Pavilion for almost half of its operating life, they're arguably responsible for perpetuating a lot of interest in Epcot's defunct history as a whole. A notable difference between their case and the ones that we'll be referencing here is that while they were exploring, Horizons was open, but the majority of interest garnered in Wonders of Life was after its closure. This means that it was less about archiving operating attractions and hiding behind set pieces to evade capture, and more about exploring an abandoned space which stood right in guest view. While the standard fare had occurred within the pavilion, most notably sneaking through open doors to capture details of defunct attractions, the Wonders of Life Pavilion has perhaps one of the most interesting, layered, and downright wild exploring stories there is. Allow me to set the scene through further vague allusions. As a general rule, when anything in the park starts to get too much attention, Disney addresses it. Up until that point, things tend to get gently put to the wayside, and that isn't a criticism of Disney in particular, but rather an assessment of business as a whole. Most things only get addressed when they get noticed, rather than proactively. This is due to economic and time constraints, and is especially aggravated in the case of a business that's under as much shareholder and public scrutiny as the Walt Disney Company. What I'm saying with this is that your local visitor attraction is going to be able to get away with a lot more for a lot longer than Disney is. We've seen this specifically at Disney in regards to food items, paint jobs, abandoned water parks, and here, an entire pavilion left for 10 years. Generally, foot visitors to an abandoned attraction aren't causing too much more than a nuisance, and this was the case for Wonders of Life Pavilion until it wasn't. Following the 2017 festival closure, really shocking and impressive videos emerged of explorers inside the pavilion. They showed everything from trash cans to the attractions, including Cranium Command, which was still intact. The most notable part of Cranium Command, both at the time of opening and post-closure, was the Buzzy animatronic, which remained in the 200-seat theatre lifelessly suspended in the air in near-perfect condition a decade after closing. While this in the timeline was the point at which people became really interested in Buzzy and the wider abandoned pavilion, Buzzy had previously been targeted in 2012, just 6 years after the attraction's permanent closure, and had his gloves removed. It's believed that the gloves were taken on the night of Epcot's 30th anniversary. Fast forward to 2018, and after further attraction signage was removed, perhaps by explorers or perhaps for archival purposes, the most ambitious acquisition thus far occurred, with Buzzy's hat, headset and bomber jacket being stolen. A police report will be filed in the summer of 2018. But what happened next was absolutely wild, as Buzzy literally could not catch a break. I won't delve into the full details of what happened next. There are dozens of videos on the subject that I definitely recommend watching instead, and you might enjoy going down the rabbit hole. But in short, one day the Buzzy animatronic was there, sans a number of clothing items, and then the next, on an unknown day between August 8th and November 19th, he was gone entirely. Where did he go? Was Buzzy kidnapped? How did they get him out? Was it an inside job? And if it wasn't, then how do you take an entire animatronic unnoticed? And if you do get him out, where did he go? Alternatively, did Disney take the animatronic for storage and not make an announcement so as to keep a low profile for the pavilion in an attempt to dissuade any further potential urban exploration? The disappearance sparked a lot of questions and didn't provide many answers. I do try to avoid speculation in these informative videos, bringing it in only for exposition and then highlighting it as such. But all of these are very valid questions, none of which have a concrete answer to date. While we can't speak for the status or welfare of the animatronic himself, we do know that an NBA player unknowingly purchased clothes from Buzzy, which have since been returned to the Disney company after their sale came to light. I'll let you read more about the case and the associated theories after this video, but let me know what you think in the comments. Either way, the Buzzy animatronic was removed from the pavilion, whether by force or by choice, and until we inevitably see Buzzy at a future D23 event, the mystery will forever remain. All of this to say, the abandoned pavilion garnered a lot of attention, arguably more than when it was open, and then became a problem that, as described previously, needed to not only be addressed, but addressed quickly, thus birthing the Play Pavilion. Announced in February 2019, the Play Pavilion was dubbed as an innovative interactive city. The name was originally temporary but ended up sticking. This new development would take the place of the Wonders of Life Pavilion, housed in the same gold dome, but the interior would be completely updated and nothing from its previous life would remain. The announcement date is crucial in consideration of the working theory above, as you'd expect something of this scale to be saved for a Parks panel announcement, but instead it was shared seemingly out of the blue, implying that it was a reactive decision in response to the situation. Similarly, Wonders of Life Archive shared that as of spring 2019, the Cranium Command building was mostly empty and the interior stage set piece had been demolished. We also know that Body Wars was picked apart and the Goofy About Health stage had been cleared out, but this final demolition stretch, again seemingly out of the blue, indicated the above theory also. The new pavilion would have a futuristic Tokyo at night look to it and be, I quote, bursting with games and hands-on activities. Reportedly unlike anything ever seen at Epcot before, guests would be able to explore, create and interact with Disney characters in completely new, undisclosed ways which were not further explored in the press release. The concept art made it look a lot like a Kid City kind of spot, with notable appearances from Edna Mode, Marie from the Aristocats and Joy from Inside Out. Walt Disney World News Today reported in mid-2019 that the pavilion would house Animation Academy, which was once located in Hollywood Studios, have a Wreck-It Ralph meet and greet and an arcade, and also a game called Hotel Heist, which would be hosted by Nick and Judy from Zootopia, and can be seen in the corner of the concept art. With all of this excitement and buzz around the area, Play Pavilion was expected to open in time for Walt Disney World's 50th anniversary in 2021. But unfortunately, the Play Pavilion did not open for Walt Disney World's 50th anniversary in 2021. There was obviously a bit of a hurdle for all projects in the form of the 2020 and 21 lockdowns, and we witnessed other confirmed projects being silently shelved in this period. But this project was so far developed that despite never actually coming into fruition, it appeared on park maps as late as 2023, with multiple map iterations marking the site as the future home of Play. That was until one day, again, it was no longer there. It had been completely wiped from the map. Similarly, many of the company website entries which referenced the Play Pavilion had been edited or archived. There wasn't and still has not been a formal announcement of the cancellation of the pavilion, but considering the quiet post-lockdown cancelling of the aforementioned projects, it's clear that the company is shying away from publicly conceding. The current existing general contractor permit for the Wonders of Life Pavilion is due to expire on December 31st this year. So it will be easier to gauge what comes next when we learn if that's an extension, and therefore implied intention to continue work, or if the permit simply expires, indicating that perhaps they're calling on the pavilion as a whole. But as there were no updates announced at the 2024 D23 Parks panel about the area, I think that's very indicative that the project, or any work on the project in the next few months for that matter, will not be occurring. Cancelled plans, disappearing animatronics, and a foreboding yellow tent that's tactfully cropped out of Disney Park Instagram photos, the pavilion really is an unknown mess right now. And the future of the pavilion is even murkier, with no plans, blue sky or grounded, offered by the park for over 5 years. Moving forward, I'd love to see the area repurposed, perhaps with the Play Pavilion idea revisited as with a few tweaks. This would help to root Epcot back in its innovation, exploration, education rhetoric. It wouldn't happen, and honestly it barely even fits, but I'm just throwing it out there that a Disney Quest revival wouldn't be so bad. More on her another day. There's also been talk about it becoming an inside-out pavilion, but I think following the demolition of the attractions in there, it's just not worth it. I don't see that happening under any circumstances. If Cranium Command was still there, however, I could see it happening, but where that's gone, I just don't. Many would argue what Epcot lacks is attractions, and I agree with that, but I don't think that has to mean roller coasters. If we begin to broaden our horizons, regarding what an attraction is, it allows for a more creative, innovative and exciting park to emerge. I've been giving it some thought and I really can't find a way to gel the health and wellness theme back into the pavilion without allowing this to be secondary to a different core theme. If we were to take a more literal approach to the Wonders of Life while sticking to its current tried and true usage, why not have it as a new permanent festival hub, exploring the social aspects of life at each festival? We've already seen this work at Flower and Garden and Food and Wine, but for the Festival of the Arts, it could house the Animation Academy drawing classes, an idea which was already proposed for the Play Pavilion, with classes led by Edna Mode from The Incredibles. For the Festival of the Holidays, they could have a dedicated celebration from a different country each day. The space could go back to hosting food booths, whilst having a pre-world showcase whistle-stop tour of multiple cultures, perhaps including those that aren't covered around the lake. This, however, would feel slightly redundant and poorly planned considering that's exactly what the World Showcase is going for, so let's try something else. The key issue I see with updating the pavilion is that it's sandwiched between two space-centric attractions and the restaurant Space 220. This doesn't bode too well for an international showcase, a play centre, or, at worst, a fitness and health attraction, so why not try a space theme instead? Think Kennedy Space Station style showcase. The pavilion could be split into sections which will connect the neighbouring space attractions, aid area cohesion, and also inspire a little bit of education. Not only would the pavilion have sections for the history and future of space exploration, as well as the depiction of space in literature and media, but perhaps it could have some quirky space-inspired festival foods, serving food made from freeze-dried ingredients or taste bud reinvigorators like wasabi. Okay, so I hear you asking, how does this tie into the new World of Motion-inspired test track overhaul? Easy. Put a rocket section into test track. Have a simulated space launch at the end of the track when the doors open and boom, we've sorted it all. However, all of this said, this overhaul really hinges on the presence of the aging Mission Space attraction, which is already mid to poorly received. My theory is, if Mission Space gets a life-extending overhaul, the Wonders of Life Pavilion will stay and be repurposed or redesigned. If, however, an announcement is made for the closure of Mission Space in the next 2 years, I would say confidently that the pavilion will be removed entirely. As we know, floor space at Epcot is especially valuable, so it wouldn't come as a surprise to me if the two are removed for a whole new attraction, related to motion or exploration in some way. To summarise, it's a hard pill to swallow, but I don't anticipate seeing the Wonders of Life ever restored to its former glory, regardless of theme. Rather, I would hazard a guess that the attraction will be present for as long as its neighbour, Mission Space, and will be rethemed to, hopefully, tie the attractions together and once again create a more cohesive vision for the park by offering a new identity to the area known ambiguously as World Discovery. As soon as that attraction is removed, however, I believe Wonders of Life will follow suit and the area will be redeveloped. Does this make me a little bit miserable? Yes, however, I think it would be a likely possibility. So, from start to finish, conception to death, that was our Wonders of Life history tour. If you enjoyed this video, don't hesitate to let me know by liking, subscribing or commenting, and also let me know if there was anything I missed out on, with the exception of the MetLife blimp and the signage, as I didn't want to mention those anyway. Also, if anyone knows anyone who worked on the Wonders of Life project, send them my way because I would love to do an updated video kind of covering the creative's perception of it and the whole process. Just putting it out there. So what do you think will happen to the Wonders of Life Pavilion? Will it ever be saved, or will it slowly rot away, forgotten until it's in such a bad shape that it has to be removed? If you've made it to the end of the video, thank you for your time and I hope you've enjoyed it. Stay tuned for more deep dives, let me know which topic you'd like explored next, and see you soon.